What's up YouTube? Ryan Pandy here. Hope you guys are doing reasonably well. I am not kidding when I say that I've had this video in the tank for like almost 3 years. I was recently just like cleaning out files on my computer and I found Carcass discography ranking on my hard drive and there's all these notes and I'm like, shit, I never fucking shot this. Why the hell not? Carcass are, in a sense, the single most influential band in the history of extreme metal. And I know that sounds really, really aggressive to say, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who would dispute that, but hear me out here. The reason I say that is because of the scope of Carcass's influence. Because they constantly reinvented themselves throughout that classic run of albums, what happened is they blazed a different trail in each subgenre that they touched. Think about it. You have grindcore, you have death grind, you have melodic death metal, you have death and roll. Every step of the way, they were really important, really influential, but to an entirely different group of people. And I realize that sounds a little bit extra, and obviously there were other bands involved in the creation of all these subgenres, but that's why it's like weirdly impossible to trace the lineage of Carcass when you listen to newer bands, because it's just as likely that Cattle Decapitation and Trivium and Wormrot were all influenced by Carcass in some manner, or at least some era of the band. And that's truly special. There's no discography in metal quite like it. Even a band like Death, which are obviously one of the most influential extreme metal bands, everything great about them pretty much stays within the realms of prog metal or death metal. It doesn't go that far outside it. Whereas with Carcass, you could talk about 5 or 6 albums of theirs and you're talking about 5 or 6 different genres. And another byproduct of the band having so much variation in their catalog is there's virtually no fan consensus. Like, you have no idea how I'm gonna rank these albums. Mathematically, I think there's 6 albums, so it's either 36 or 64, I forget how stats works, but a lot of possibilities. Just try and hear me out here. Obviously, if you're new to the band, I really hope this helps you navigate their catalog according to your taste, since there's gonna be some variety here. And if your opinion's already formed, you can tell me why I'm dead wrong. Sound good? Number 6 is the easiest one for me to rank here, Reek of Putrefaction. The band's rough and messy debut came out right at the onset of grindcore, and a lot of grindcore purists still worship this album for helping establish some pretty solid fundamentals for the genre, alongside, of course, Napalm Death and Repulsion, etc., etc. But let's fucking face it, this album sounds like dog shit. The thing is, it's one of those few extreme metal albums where the rough quality and the less refined quality of the production actually detracts from the intensity of the music. Like, whether or not you like those early Darkthrone records, for example, you can't deny that there's something about that shitty fucking quality that makes the music darker and really adds to the intensity of it, whether you like it or not. But in the case of this album, it's actually detracting from otherwise some pretty cool riffs and grooves in songs like Burnt to a Crisp, which is maybe my favorite on here, Maggot Colony. It doesn't make them more intense or easier to decipher. It makes them harder to figure out what's going on, and it just kind of makes you feel distant from what's going on. And look, this is not a fucking new insight. The band have discussed publicly how much the production on this album blows. All that being said though, let's be clear here. An album being your least favorite by a band or the most sloppily produced doesn't necessarily mean that it's the least influential. Because the gory lyrics on here that are laced with all that complicated medical terminology, that was very distinctive for the time period, and it was even a whole other level up from like Slayer talking about the Holocaust, for instance. Bands like Autopsy, Cannibal Corpse, their first records, you can just draw a direct line back to Carcass. And for the genre of grindcore, like I said, it's a pioneering album. It's just when you listen to this album, it's tough to see past the fact that the genre would evolve past this so quickly. Like the Brutal Truth record, Extreme Conditions, which is iconic for grindcore, it only came out like 4 years after this. So when I listen to Reek, it's not really like an enjoyment thing. Like, I rank these albums in order of enjoyment, and this is by far the least enjoyable Carcass record. And number 5 is the band's solid comeback record, Surgical Steel. When you look back over the band's career, it mostly aims to recapture the Heartwork era of the band, more than any other at least. And there's some great tracks on here, it's just not an essential record from the band. Granulating Dark Satanic Mills is maybe my favorite on here. It's got that pure Iron Maiden influence, kind of a gallop to it, very melodic. If you like groove metal, you'll love Master Butcher's Apron, you'll love Congealed Clot. And then there's a lot of just pure thrash metal on here too, like the song Cadaver's Pouch. I really enjoyed this album when it came out. I still listen to it from time to time. It was an album that, as a comeback record, really met all of our expectations. Between this one and then the At the Gates record that came out the next year, they both really met our expectations, but at the same point, they weren't essential to either band's catalog. But absolutely, a fun record, a well-produced record, and a well-executed record. All right, number 4 now. I'm going to venture a wild guess and say that any dislikes that this video gets, this point is where they're probably gonna start rolling in. Necroticism, which is the band's 3rd album, one of their most beloved and most influential, but for me personally, massively overrated. To me, this is Carcass's only straight ahead death metal album. So it shares a lot of the characteristics of that early death metal scene, like a lot of the albums that were made at Moorsound Studios in Florida, for example. We could take Cause of Death, or we could take that first Massacre album, From Beyond. We could take those as our main comparison points here. And that's actually what my issue with this album is that it shares a lot of the negative traits of a lot of those other albums. The completely unnecessarily long songs with these meandering, really loose song structures. You have these repetitive, robotic chugga 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 riffs where it's just literally just sped up a little bit. You have a completely monochromatic emotional palette to draw from. It's just one fucking scowl for 40 minutes. In my book, these are all things that death metal would improve on massively in just the next few years. So this album might have been really, really important for its time, but it just does not hit as hard now as it would have in the early 90s. And when you consider it in the context of Carcass's entire catalog, Necroticism kind of exists in this gulf in the middle, where it's not nearly as extreme or as punishing as those first two records, but it's also not as melodic as what would come next. So it kind of like falls through the cracks in a way. And also, I've just never been able to shake this feeling that all of the fucking praise that is heaped onto Necroticism year after year is all sort of a neighborhood effect for how unbelievably perfect the song Incarnated Solvent Abuse is, which is the album's centerpiece track and quite literally a top 10 death metal song of all time. This song is just a fucking avalanche of mind-blowing fucking riffs. They just keep coming and coming and coming and coming. And just when you think this fucking song is just out of gas, you get hit with that fucking China breakdown at the end there. It's just, it really is a perfect death metal song, and I think a lot of the love for this album is just kind of, you think about that song, that's the first thing you think of when you think of Necroticism. But when you actually dissect like the meat of it, there are some really overly long songs in here that just go on and on, like Carney's Cacophony or the opener In Propagation. It's not all it's hyped up to be as an album, especially when we listen to it 30 plus years later. Number 3, which I have the softest spot in my heart for, and is by far my favorite album of theirs to discuss, is Swansong. One of the most hated albums to come out of extreme metal in the 90s, or really any decade, because this is the album where Carcass went even more melodic and went into what's known now as a death and roll sound, where you mix death metal with straight up corny ass hard rock. And so you can imagine how well that was received by extreme metal fans at the time. Although now, 25 years later, this album is like the most coveted album in the Earache Records vinyl catalog, having interned for them a few years ago, but I digress. Before I sit here and try to argue the merits of death and roll, though, it should be noted that this entire album is not that. That's the reputation it has, but in reality, there's a substantial amount of material on here. Don't Believe a Word, Firm Hand, which just sounds like every Arch Enemy song ever. The song Cross My Heart, too, which would fit comfortably on Surgical Steel. There's a lot of stuff on here that really just sounds like Heartwork, but dialed back a little bit. So there is some relation between these two records, and in fact, a few months after Heartwork came out, the band put out the lesser-known Heartwork EP, which features a song called Rotten Roll. And when you listen to that EP, it connects the dots between these two records even more clearly. So we have to dispel that misconception that the entirety of Swansong is played in a death and roll style, because it's just not. That said, though, Carcass letting out this like almost flamboyant rock-tinged side makes for the only record in their catalog that can be described as fun. And I know fun is a pretty weird thing to label anything that's Carcass related, but that's just what it is. Like the song Black Star has this addictive like bounce to it, and those blues rock guitars in the chorus are just fucking sick. Really those first 3 songs on the record, Keep On Rotting the Free World, also Tomorrow Belongs to Nobody, they're so fucking jarring when you first hear them, because you have that harsh vocal still being paired with this riff underneath it that just sounds like it does not belong at all. But once you kind of get past that and get that initial shock, this record is just so much fun. Tomorrow Belongs to Nobody has always struck me as particularly euthanasia-esque, which for me is an exceedingly positive thing to say. For most metalheads, it's not. But Polarize is another favorite song. You can really hear the influence on a modern band like Trivium in that song. Child's Play is almost like sickeningly bright and melodic, especially with that fucking harmonized solo in the middle. Also Rock the Vote. Swansong is messy though too. Once the cowbell shows up, that'll really make you groan, and you'll probably suffer through the stiffer and more boring tracks like Room 101. I'm really not a fan of that song, but overall, Carcass's catalog is made so much more interesting by Swansong being in it. And as far as the death and roll subgenre, I put quotes around it because I'm not really sure it's a subgenre, but in terms of that style, Wolverine Blues by Entombed really is the definitive statement. I don't think of Swansong when I think of it, but it is a landmark nonetheless, And the fact that it mixes that style with so much melodic death metal really explains why, you know, future generations ended up fawning over it, because it just combines a lot of the stuff that we love. So I'll fucking defend Swansong to the grave. It is a must listen, absolutely. Our runner-up is Carcass's sophomore release, the death grind classic Symphonies of Sickness. Never mind just the massive growth arc from Reek of Putrefaction to this album, which is an impressive in and of itself. But Symphonies of Sickness will always be on my Mount Rushmore of grind albums, because it taught us, and it continues to teach us, that 1 + 1 can really equal 3 when it comes to infusing grindcore into traditional extreme metal. Because to put this in context here, Symphonies was released in the same year as Repulsion's Horrified, which, along with those first couple Napalm Death records, is pretty much the grind Bible, and stylistically speaking, features a lot more of the hardcore punk portion of grindcore's genetics, and also a little bit of thrash here and there, and lots of crazy blast beats. Whereas by comparison, Symphonies dips its toes into the metal world a lot more, really into death metal, and it results in my opinion, the meaner sounding album. Better, who knows, but definitely meaner. I will take, for instance, the best song on the album, Excoriating Abdominal Emanation, which just in the midst of all this chaos and general disgustingness, kind of the Reek of Putrefaction type Carcass, all of a sudden it just parts the seas and explodes into this punishing mid-tempo breakdown with synchronized double bass and just the whole nine. This part of the song gives it such a strong metallic anchor from which to branch out. And you can say that about a lot of stuff on this album. You can say it about the more riff-centric songs on here, like in Pathological Necroticism, or you could say about the songs that make use of lead guitars, like Exhume to Consume or Cadaveric Incubator. It really gives this record a sense of controlled chaos, where the lines between early death metal and grindcore can be constantly blurred, but it's relatively easy and straightforward to follow. Songs don't necessarily have to be 40 seconds and have zero structure. And that's why, I mean, to this day, bands like Cattle Decaf and Pig Destroyer owe this groundbreaking album an enormous debt, not to mention maybe their careers. Which leaves Heartwork. The question of what is the best and most influential melodic death metal album of all time, it just has two answers. That's it. You can say Heartwork, you can say Slaughter of the Soul. Those are the only two answers that are acceptable. I'm actually a Slaughter of the Soul guy, because I think that album more precisely pinpointed a replicable formula that's been constantly copied over and over again. So for that reason, it's the more definitive album for the genre, but there's a strong argument for Heartwork as well. Albums like Heartwork are why Necroticism sounds so dated to me. The death metal genre has gone in so many interesting different directions since its inception, and by far one of the most interesting is the way Carcass slowed the genre down to mid-tempo, really tightened up the song structures, made the riffs into hooks in and of themselves, and got rid of all that kind of boring bottom-end chugga-chugging. And they also threw in all these classic metal influences with soaring guitar harmonies and traditional solo sections that were extended. And in doing all that, they really birthed a melodic death metal blueprint. You cannot overstate the importance of this record. It unlocked a seemingly infinite potential within the extreme metal world. And many people don't realize it, but a lot of people hated this album when it came out. There's a whole camp of Carcass fans who still hate this album. And you listen to a song like No Love Lost, which is so melodic and so groove-oriented, you kind of understand it. But the quality of the songs just does not lie when all is said and done. Whether it's the completely anthemic title track, or the thrashy Carnal Forge, or the masterpiece that is Death Certificate with those snarling guitar riffs, or the iconic intro of Buried Dreams. This is the band's most musically accomplished, most mature, and by a mile, best sounding album. And it's still extreme. It's still an extreme metal album. That line between brutality and polish is walked on this album with such precision, and that's why, like almost 30 years later, Heartwork is still the benchmark for melodic death metal, and really just for extreme metal in general. And it's why I marvel at it every time I listen to it. And there you are, Carcass's discography ranked by yours truly. Literally like 3 years in the making, even though my opinions never actually changed. Sometimes it happens, you just kind of put something down and you never know when you're gonna pick it up. So save your work. Whether you like to write about music or knit sweaters or draw pictures or whatever, save your work, because you never know when you're gonna stumble upon something and be like, shit, I never fucking finished that. I'm really glad I found this and decided to shoot it, because like they're that rare band that had a hand in so many different important movements within extreme metal. So yeah, if you're new to Carcass, I would definitely recommend listening to at least the top 4. just to get an idea. And if you're a fan, of course, be sure to post your list in the comments, because that's what this is all about. Hope I did the band's great legacy some justice. And as always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video and not yet subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so by clicking right over here, as well as checking out any other rock or metal related content that I publish here on a weekly basis. I really appreciate you guys watching, liking, disliking, just engaging in any fashion. Twitter, Instagram handle @RyanPianiMusic. Again, thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you soon.